Go ahead and kick it off because we have a lot to uncover today. Hi, everyone. Farah here from the product marketing team here at Cypress. Super stoked for today's session. Appreciate everyone who's tuning in. David, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Awesome. So to kick it off, I just wanted to remind everyone on this call that this session is being recorded. It will be sent to you following this call, as well as all other registrants in the coming days. We do have a huge community by way of Discord, so we encourage you to share any of your learnings from today's topics and keep the conversation going. And then finally, a reminder that we do try to keep a good frequency here at Cypress as it relates to virtual events and learnings. So keep your eye out on our events page, including mentioned speakers and lineups for our upcoming second annual Cypress Conf, which is going to be taking place this October, which is super exciting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So David is presenting today, but just as a reminder, we've had a few of these customer spotlight sessions now, and really the thought behind these spotlight series is intended to highlight customers of Cypress Cloud and provide a platform for shared experiences and success stories. So our goal is to really inspire and empower users like yourselves with valuable information from and insights from others in the testing community that you can bring back and share with your own teams to really implement a testing culture that incorporates the latest best practices. So today I am joined by David Ingraham, who also happens to be a Cypress ambassador, as well as a senior software developer engineer and test at Matium. So hello, David. Lots of Cypress Cloud experience gained from his previous tenure at Disney. And just an overall great person to collaborate with. The topic of today's discussion, as you all know, is one I think this group will really resonate with, which is flake and strategies and tools for handling flakiness so that you can really easily understand, identify, and implement best practices at your organization, especially as it relates to mitigating flake. So without further ado, David, I will pass it along to you to go ahead and kick off today's session.
Well, that was quite the flattering introduction. Thank you so much. It's quite a pleasure to be here. And like you said, my name is David Ingraham. I'm Cypress ambassador. I've had backgrounds in both startups and big companies. And regardless of the size of your company or your application, test flake happens. It impacts all of us, which is why I'm sure everybody is here today. So there's a lot to talk about. We're going to talk in depth about all things flake, first by identifying what is flake, what's the definition of it, how do we understand it and think about it. Then we're going to take a look at how you detect flake, specifically how Cypress Cloud, and you can leverage those features to detect flake, both short-term but long-term. Then we're going to look at some code, a couple examples about how you can resolve some common areas of flake. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this funny, silly acronym I've called No More Flake, which is just the concept of how do you get to a state where your machines are operating reliably, all the time, and you've reduced flake entirely. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and steps to move forward. Okay, so what is test flake? Why are we here? I'm sure everybody knows at a high level, test flake is when you have a test that returns different results without there being seemingly any code changes, right? I run a test once and it passes, and I run a test a second time and it fails. What do I trust? Do I trust the failure? Do I trust the pass? How do I have any confidence in my result? When I first started automation testing, test flake was kind of this mysterious and evil force that kind of was doom and gloom on all my test suites. And I didn't really know why. It was very frustrating. It didn't make sense. I was just retrying things more and more, hoping it would go away. And the more practice and experience I have, the more I've learned to think that test flake is really just variables impacting your test. It's just like a science experiment or a math equation. If you understand the variables within the kind of that problem and you can control them, you have greater confidence in the output. And once I started thinking about that and started breaking down the different variables that are impacting my tests, I saw a lot more improvements and better confidence long-term. So some common variables and things that we're going to talk about with cloud and some code are simply tool misuse. This is kind of a basic one, a little bit funny, but I think it's often overlooked that you can actually hurt yourself if you misuse the tool that you're using. Do you actually understand Cypress in and out? I ask for a show of hands, but I'm just curious, like, has anyone genuinely read all of the Cypress documentation when you first started? Or did you kind of just get into it and then start looking up some docs as you needed help? This could save you time ahead of time, especially if you kind of skip some best practices, but just misusing the tool could introduce flake. And we'll look at an example later. Of course, environmental differences, right? If I run a test on my machine, is it going to work on your machine? If I run a test with a test runner locally, is it going to run headless and pass against a dev environment? So environmental differences, different the ways different environments perform, which ties into kind of race conditions, right? So how fast are requests being made against different environments? If my test takes 5 seconds to return an API call, but your test takes 10, is our test going to be able to handle that? Or is mine going to fail, yours going to pass, or vice versa? Of course, data dependencies. How do we get our data? How does the test handle the data? Is it dependent on data existing, or is it controlling its own data? Is the data going to exist against different environments? You can see how these are all kind of intertwined. Test independence. So is your test dependent on the state of other tests, right? We're going to look at an example with this as well. But if you have a test failure, do you know that that test failure is isolated to that one test, or did something upstream impact it, confusing and muddling things? Test retry ability. This is an interesting one as well, and goes hand in hand with data dependencies. Again, we're going to take another look at an example of this, but just being able to run a test once is awesome, but can you reliably retry it over and over again for it to pass? And then non-deterministic app behavior, of course. Maybe the issue isn't just the test or the environment or the data, but maybe the app is just behaving weird, right? Maybe there's an issue in our application that our test is catching, which is causing random behavior. So there's all these variables, and sometimes it's not just the test fault. Maybe we need to put our focus somewhere else. And then, of course, other external dependencies that our app or test suite depend on. An example is like an authentication service or like Auth0. So if you're running 100 tests in parallel and you have to authenticate with every single one of those, are you going to hit a rate limit? And are half of your tests going to fail randomly or not? So things like that, all these variables that can impact your test, how do you go about controlling them? So why does any of this matter? Why are we here? As you all know, the whole point of writing automation tests is to improve our confidence and the experience of our users and our customers when we deliver software. We want to write a good automation test where when we push new code, we're confident that it works and that we can deliver fast, right? Test flake muddles all of that. It undermines our overall test confidence, and it kind of takes away from the overall purpose of what we're doing with our jobs. I like to think that if you have a suite of 50 tests and they're all flaky, that's actually worse than having 0 tests, right? And here's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, it decreases your test confidence, but test flakiness also decreases engineering trust, right? You don't want to get to a state where your engineering team is looking at a pipeline and then saying, oh, another test failure. Oh, it's just flaky. That's okay. We can ignore that. But what if it's a real bug, right? You never want to get into that state, which of course leads into increased bugs with, like false positives, false negatives. We want to trust our results, but also increased debugging time, engineering costs, tech debt. We're spending so much time focusing on supporting stuff just to get it to work, rather than pushing our efforts into writing new tests or validating new stuff and moving things forward. And then pipeline time, right? If you have 100 tests and they're all flaky and you configure retries, well, now your pipeline is taking twice as long. You're actually running 200 tests if everything is flaky, which is doubling the time of your pipeline to execute. So reducing that flake also improves your pipeline time. So there's a lot of negatives to having test flake around, but that's okay. There's also a lot of ways that we can go about mitigating them. So ways to recognize flake, of course, are with just running multiple test executions, right? Locally, you can do this using dot only, which I'll show, but I'll also show kind of a cool tip where you can wrap a test in like a for each loop and run it multiple times and get really quick feedback right away. Or you can use the pipeline and configure retries, which we'll also dive into. But it's not just about identifying flake when it happens. It's also important to look at historical patterns as well to see the overall health of your test suite. Do I know how flaky my test suite is across a month's worth of test executions? Can I get that data? And within that, can I categorize different tests as being high severity, low severity, higher priority? being able to provide a lot of data, especially when you have a test suite that is already flaky and you're battling all this tech debt, really helps give you the best approach to mitigating and getting to a state of no flake in the future. And we're going to look at all the ways that Cypress Cloud can help with this. Okay, so yeah, speaking of Cypress and Cypress Cloud, before we get into the demo, what we're going to talk about is retries and experimental retries. I don't know if a lot of people know that there's this thing called experimental retries. I can't remember when it got released. It's recently, but you have more control over how you retry your test flake in the pipeline. So we're going to take a look at that and demo that. And then we're going to take a look at how Cypress Cloud and some of these features can help with flake. So we're going to look at how Cypress identifies flake, some test analytics, how it categorizes flake severity, and then how you get alerted in some integrations. And then just for some fun, those images on this slide were all AI generated when I put the prompt Cypress Cloud in. So Cypress, of course, is a tree, and you can kind of see where AI had some fun with that. All right, so let's take a look at some code. So I think everybody can see my screen. So this is the Cypress configuration file. So we're going to talk about how you can enable retries in the pipeline. So this is kind of the old way of doing it. The old way, or I guess the current way. Most people are probably doing it this way. So in your configuration file, you identify you want retries, and you can say run mode. I want one retry in the pipeline. So this means in the pipeline, if there was a failure, of course, it's going to retry one time. And if it succeeded the second time, our test passes, right? And this is the common way of doing things right now. But with experimental retries, we actually have a lot more control over different behavior if we want to change kind of that default old way of doing things. So the two options you have are detect flake and pass on threshold, and detect flake but always fail. So detect flake and pass on threshold means I now have a little bit more options. I enable it with this experimental strategy value, and this is all documented online. And now I can say, I want you to retry up to 3 times. And now this is the cool part. I can also say, if there is flake, I want you to say it has to retry up to 4 times. But in order for my test to be considered passed, you have to pass 2 of those 4 times that it executes, or 2 of those 3 retries, excuse me. So let's take a look at this with the test runner. I'm going to run a flaky test here. So I just have this suite. These are going to be our core examples with the cloud. All I'm doing is just randomly generating some numbers. Essentially, this test should pass 1/10 of the time. This should pass 9/10 of the time. And this should pass, 50% of the time, just to generate random result behavior.
Hey, David, sorry, really quick. Is there any
Yep.
way to zoom in on this and make this
Is it?
text a little bit bigger for the group? Yep, that was
Is
the
that?
feedback.
Is this okay?
I think that's a lot better. But let us know, I guess, audience,
Yeah.
if it doesn't work.
Yeah. Thanks for calling that out. You guys can see this okay? More? Not quite sure how my screen
Yeah, it
translates
says,
to.
I think a little bit more is the feedback we're getting.
It
If
is.
possible.
It's very giant on my side, but as long as
Yeah, I
everybody can see
figured.
it, that's
Okay,
okay.
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Sorry about that. Interesting how that translates. All right. So we're going to take a look at the test runner, and you can see when I run my flaky test, it succeeded the first time. Great. So we passed. Let's get some different behavior. You can see we failed 1 time, and it attempted to run up to 3 times, but because I never got a failure, it actually stopped after the 3rd one because I will never get 2 passes for this test to succeed. We can see again, attempt up to 4 times, but I only got 1 pass. And so I still failed my test because of that passes threshold. Let's see if we can get a, there, well, I skipped over it, but there you go. You can see that if it hits 2 passes, then it's going to consider it passed. There you go, like this, right? So we failed the first time, it's flaky. And then just because it passed the second time, I configured it and I said, I want you to try a 3rd time and get that second pass to work. And it did, so we considered our test pass. So this is really cool behavior. You have a little bit more control. And now we're going to take a look at the second experimental strategy, which is detect flake, but always fail. So this means that when we detect flake, I can still configure up to a certain amount of retries, and I can tell it to stop if any of my tests pass, but my test is still always going to fail. So when I save this, it's going to restart Cypress, and we're going to take another look, see what we see. So again, it ran the first time we passed because we don't see any flake. That's good. If I run it a second time, there we go. So it ran up to my 3 attempts, and I got a pass on my 3rd one, which is awesome, but I'm still failing the test. So this is interesting. So now I have more control over how I want my test results to look when there's flake, because previously, if there's flake but it still passes, my test is considered passed. But now if you want, you can say, I want my test flake to appear as a test failure, depending on how you want that displayed in Cloud. So I'm going to go ahead and close the test runner for now, and we're going to take a look at now Cloud. Switch over there. Is this good enough? Do I need to zoom in on my on Chrome here? I think it looks okay. I guess tell me if I need to. So this is Cypress Cloud, and I've just been running that suite of flaky tests over and over again the past couple days to generate some fake test results. But we can see here throughout all of my test runs, Cypress is telling me how many flaky tests I have. So in this particular test run, I have 2 flaky tests. And when I click into this, I can see what those tests are. One of those tests is part of that flake file. And if I click into this, I can get even more information on this test flake. So it's identified for me that it's flaky. And I can see what happened here. The first time it ran, it failed. And we ran again and it passed. And because I had that pass on a threshold configured, my test is still considered pass. But if I changed it to detect flake and fail, this test would have been considered a failed state. I can also see here how it's worked over time, how this test is particularly looked across a period of time. So this test, I guess I only ran yesterday, but we can see that it is failing flaky 14% of the time. So this is kind of cool. You get all this information in one spot at a really kind of low level on this particular test. You can do this for any test. If we come up here, we can also take a look and see the failure rate. And I think this one is, flake rate here. Yeah, you could see it's flaky every single time, right? This test is completely unreliable. So you get really cool in-depth information when you're looking at a specific test case in Cloud. But you can also get that high level, right? We want to talk about tracking flake across a period of time. And you can come over here to analytics, and you have all these flaky test metrics. And this is super neat. So let's take a look at the past 30 days. I actually don't know if that'll change anything. Yep. So past 30 days, I get this report, right, where I can see that I have 22% flakiness. And of course, I'm triggering a lot of this flakiness. This is a terrible number. You don't want to, we want this to be low. But if this was my real app and I see this number, it's overwhelming. But now I have the data to begin to reduce that number, right? Where do we start with our tech debt? I can see that I have specific categorized flake. So I can start with maybe my high severity. Again, that one test that is flaky 7 out of 7 times, which is not good. This test is essentially useless, right? We can't trust any of the results any of the time. So this might be a test that I prioritize just because it is so flaky and it's not giving me any value. But what if I come down here to something like this low test, which is failing flaky 2 out of 23 times? Yeah, that's a small number, but what if this test was critical to our application and I needed this to, I want to ensure this passes in order to do a release. So maybe even though this is low severity of flake, it might still be critical enough to prioritize first. So having these conversations with your team, this is where I would begin to do it. It starts here as you get these metrics, and then you can start to talk about value to your application, as well as how often things are flaky and how you can trust them in the overall scope of your application. So we've kind of looked at tracking things long-term. We're going to now look at some integrations. So Cypress has some awesome integrations that I'm sure many are aware of. One of them is with GitHub. You can see I've just run this PR 43 times just to trigger all these results. But what's cool is each time Cypress gives me this summary of all of my latest runs, right? And that last run had 2 flaky tests. And I can get all this information on failed, passed, flaky. I can come in here and look at that one flaky test, and I can click on any of these, and these will take me back to Cloud. We can integrate with Slack, Teams, GitLab. So chances are tools that you're using, you can get that feedback fast, and Cloud is going to integrate and tell you as soon as the pipeline is finished, we have some issues and we need to address them right away. So this is how you identify flake and are able to track it both short-term and also long-term with Cypress. Now we're going to kind of get into some of the fun stuff, which is the code and thinking about how you can resolve some common types of flake. So Okay. Yep. So one of the first thing we're going to talk about is, again, we're talking about these variables, right? So these variables that are impacting our tests. And one of these variables is tool understanding, the concept of, do you actually understand what you're using and what you're working with? Do you understand the commands you're using? Are you using the right commands at the appropriate time? And are you on the latest version of that tool? This is kind of an important one to call out. And again, one I think is overlooked. But I see a lot in the community. People are still on version like 10 or lower with Cypress, which is okay. But if you don't know, Cypress has made amazing improvements between version 10 and version 13. They've done a lot of DOM refetching work. They've done a lot of like command querying work, I believe, on Cypress 12. So there's a lot of improvement that just naturally helps with performance, but also with helping with flaky and specifically race conditions that are just immediately resolved by upgrading, right? So if you've been sitting on upgrading just because it's too much of a hassle, do it. We always want the latest tool, right? As it improves and gets better, you want those improvements back. And you might actually just be hurting yourself by not upgrading to the latest version or close to the latest version. So we're going to talk about misusing a command. In particular, we're going to talk about CUI intercept. And what this test does is I'm just going to visit a raw HTML page, which I'll show you really quick. It's nothing special. It's just a table with a bunch of Cypress logos and some titles and basically nonsensical data for the purpose of our application. But what we're going to do is we're going to hit that HTML page. I've added a tiny wait in here just to simulate loading a more kind of a real application, because this triggers so quick. I want there to be a little delay loading my app. We'll talk about why you would never do this in the real world. This is just to kind of simulate a fake application. I then want to intercept some endpoints that this application is calling. It's reaching out to a Flickr service to fetch some of those images, that image, and it's going to populate it in the table. So I want to wait for all those images to be fetched. So what I do is I define my intercept here, and then in my test, I alias it, and then I use cy.wait, and I'm saying wait on that request to finish all those API calls to finish before validating that some part of my app is visible. So it's a pretty straightforward test, but it's actually flaky, and I'm sure some of you have already identified why, but let's take a look at it. Oh, and one thing I want to call out as well before I do this is I've wrapped my test in Cypress low dash times. This is kind of that trick I wanted to call out. Instead of rerunning this each time one at a time, this test is actually going to run 5 times for me, which is kind of a neat trick that you can use locally when you really want to throttle a specific test. So let's go ahead and run this one test. And you can see it's going to run 5 times. Let's see if we can simulate some flakiness. Awesome. We got it right away. So you can see the first 2 times this test passed. We got a failure the second time. It's gonna fail in a second. Any second now. Oh shoot! I forgot to turn off retries. It's actually gonna run 3 times. That's okay. But you can see already the point is we're getting random behavior for a very simple test, right? Where we're passing 2 times. It's gonna fail down here again. For a test that has like 4 lines of code, right? This is kind of it's frustrating, but it's entirely my fault because I am misusing the tool and the commands that I want to use with this test. So I'm going to go ahead and come back here. We're going to close this, and I'm actually going to turn off this for the other examples. And then back to the code. So what's going on here? I'm sure many of you have already identified this, but the problem here is my CUI intercept command, right? I'm defining it too late. So the way that Cypress works and and my test works is it's queuing up all these commands, right? What Cypress does is it visits my application. And then after it visits my application, it says, I want you to look for a matching request, and then I want you to wait on it. But what could happen is, and what we saw happen half the time, is that after I visited my application, as soon as I'm visiting it, this request actually triggers the real request trigger. So potentially by the time I tell Cypress to look for that real request, it's already happened. And so those failures you're seeing is it's trying to wait on something that's happened in the past. Cypress, it's doing the right thing, but I'm just incorrectly defining where that intercept occurs. So the real easy fix for this, of course, is just to define my intercept before the real request is triggered. And if I go back to my test now and run that again, you can see this is going to pass every single time. I essentially eliminated all flake just because of I just misused the tool. I misused the command. Another common command that is misused is cy.get, which we're not going to get into in depth about this because that would take up 40 minutes on its own. But there are a lot of great resources on different selectors. And do you truly understand how to utilize cy.get and the ways you can utilize cy.get? Are you actually grabbing the elements you think you're grabbing? There's cy, you have find, you have cy.contains. There's a bunch of helper packages. So that's a big topic on its own. But that is also another common command with Cypress that I see just misused just because people haven't taken the time to read the documentation or understand the best practices around it. So that's kind of talking about an example of how you can simulate flake with misusing a tool. So now we're going to look at the concept of test independence and data dependencies. So this is a pretty quick one, of course, test independence. So I have two tests that are dependent on one another, right? I visit a site, my same site again. I then want to validate some visibility. And in the second test, I want to then validate something else is visible in my site. And of course, when I run this, the second test fails. This used to pass though. And I can't remember when, again, maybe someone correct me, Cypress 12 or 11, Cypress made the switch where now it forces all of your tests to be independent. So what Cypress does is it cleans out the session between each test, so you can no longer get away and actually way with this, and it enforces independence, just right by default as soon as you install Cypress. However, if you're using previous versions of Cypress, you could still run into this. You can also disable this native behavior if you still want test dependence, although I would highly discourage that, but you do have that option. However, where I'm going with this is the overall idea and best practice to reduce and never get into the state of having tests dependent on one another is, of course, to utilize before and before each hooks to define all of your shared setup. So, of course, when I visit in a before each, now both tests gain benefit from that before each hook, and I visit my application successfully for each one. So if you're using the latest version of Cypress, you're probably not going to run into this one as much. So again, upgrading benefits you, right? Now I know that each of these tests, if they're going to fail in isolation from one another. Can take a quick drink of water really quick. So now let's take a look at Retri Ability. Now we kind of get into some more complex examples. We're going to close the test runner, and we're just going to think about a hypothetical example where we visit some site and we just want to add a user into a table. So after I visit my site, I click this add user button and I fill out a first and last name. So I'm populating myself, and then I click submit, and then I'm validating that my user is now in the table. So again, a very basic and kind of easy to understand test. It's very simple, but this test actually could have many issues. So let's kind of break them down. So the first time I run this test, it's going to work, right? I add my user, I click submit, and my user's in the table, and that's awesome, woohoo. But the second time, now I run this test, it's going to fail. And that's because of probably a common API restriction. I'm going to get a 400 on my post user call telling me that the user already exists and that I can't submit the same user twice into my table. So what do I do about this? This sucks, right? I was able to run it once the first time, and now I tried to run it a second time, and my test is completely hosed. Well, there are several approaches to getting around this, right? How do I handle my data within this test? Well, I could replace all of this static data with random data, right? I could use a library like Faker, where I can come in here and I can say like first, and then I could say faker.person.firstname. Faker is a library that randomly generates data for you. And I can do something like this. And of course, then I can replace all of these with some of my variables. And then we could replace this down here if I really wanted to, say something like first was last. Now, yeah, this would work, right? The first time I run it, I'm going to get a random combination of a username. And then the second time I run it, I'm going to get a different user. And that's awesome. So have I solved Retri Ability? The answer is maybe, right? Like depending on how you're randomly generating your data, that doesn't always eliminate and ensure collisions. If I were to run this test, 1,000 times, 10,000 times throughout the year, can I always guarantee that I'm never going to hit the same combination of first and last? What if Faker actually returns bad data, something that my API can't handle? Maybe I've accidentally failed the test for another reason. I'm giving it bad data. So random data is one way to maybe start thinking about solving the problem initially, and it could work for some situations. But in this case, we're going to take a different approach, and one of my favorites, which is having the test handle and control its own data in its own state. This is a pattern that I really, really encourage. So we think about, how is my data going to always ensure a clean state every single time I run this test? Well, one way I could do that is I could reseed the database every time, right? Every time this test runs, maybe I trigger some seed script, boom, we're in a clean state, and I can insert this user as many times as I want. Cool, that's awesome. However, if this test is running in parallel at the same time as another test, and maybe I'm resetting so much data, could I potentially be resetting something that is the other test needs, right? Maybe I'm breaking the other test because I'm deleting too much data or cleaning up too much state. So that might be one approach. Another approach is I could come in here, and after the add button, I could say like, give me the delete button. And I can come in here, and we could, or I guess before I click add, we could delete my user. We could do a conditional, like check if the user exists somehow, delete it if it does, and then I can go and add it. And that's one way to do it. However, what this does is now my test is going through the UI in places that it really doesn't need to, right? If you think about, what is this test doing? I'm testing adding a new user, but now the test has to depend on the delete user functionality working and the delete UI. And my test is slower because I'm going through the UI. So you could do that, but the best approach, in my opinion, is to take advantage of Cypress custom commands and programmatically control your state. So if we look at our Cypress commands file, I've defined a very tiny custom command here called cleanup user if exists, and it just takes a user. And what all this does is it just wraps another method that I have defined in an API file. And in here, in my user file, let's take a look at what cleanup user does. What we do is we get our user, it returns a list of users, and of course these are fake endpoints, but this is kind of the idea, is I'm using cy.request to make real API calls. I check to see if my user exists in my database. If it does, then I delete my user using a delete call. So this ensures that because I've wrapped this API, wrapped my kind of API helper in a Cypress command, I can now access it using this cy dot notation in my tests. So if I come up here and I do cleanup user if exists, and then I pass in my name, now this test is going to work every single time, regardless of what environment I'm running on, or if my tests are running in parallel. This test is cleaning up its own state in isolation of anything else. I come in here, I check if it exists in the database, I clean it up, I visit, I add it, boom, it exists. When we run it again, it cleans it up, boom, it exists. So now my test can be retried. It's data independent of anything else. It's controlling its own state. And it's a lot quicker than maybe some of these other alternative methods. So now we're going to take a look at one last example, which is race conditions. We're going to use that exact same example from before about adding a user into a user table. And we're going to think about, how do we handle when a test is doing certain actions against different environments, but things are slower in some places and faster than others. So this concept of race conditions. So we're going to think about that post call again here. So after I submit this button, that post call is going to submit my user into the database. Chances are then we're going to have a get back, which is going to then fetch back all my users, and it's going to populate the table and refresh my new users here. So what happens when this test works right now is, as soon as I click this submit button, Cypress doesn't really know. I haven't told it to do anything with these API calls. So it's immediately going to assert that my user exists in the table, which might work if your APIs are really fast, but Cypress has a default timeout of 4 seconds. So if there's any sort of lag in this post call that takes more than 4 seconds for this user to get into the table, this test is going to fail. This is a big issue that I think many see when they run their tests headless in the pipeline, right? Your tests just run a lot quicker, so it's immediately queuing up all these validations a lot faster than you might see locally, meaning you're actually going to get failures because you're not handling different race conditions. The test was working maybe in a slower environment, but not faster. So one way to get around this is, of course, with intercept, like we talked about before. So what I can do is I can define my intercept again before the real request triggers. Let's just call it CY post user, and then my URL is just like a user endpoint, and we'll say it's my post. So this is my alias. So as soon as I click the submit button, I just want to say CUI.wait on that call to finish. And now what I've done is, regardless of how fast my machine works or the pipeline, or how slow your machine works, Cypress is going to wait for that real API call to finish before validating. So I've eliminated any race conditions, any timing issues between my environments. And all I've had to do is just simply wait on a real request and tell Cypress, hold up, pause, before you do anything else, let's make sure this is finished. And this is a really cool trick that I think has eliminated a lot of my flake. Going back to explicit waits, sure, I could do something like this, where I hard code a number. You should never do this, but this might work, right? Maybe my post user call only takes 4 seconds. But the bad news about this is, one, you still open yourself up for failures, right? Maybe the app is having a bad day and my post call takes 6 seconds. Well, my test is still going to fail, right? This isn't bulletproof. A second, so what I could come in here and I could say, well, it's never going to take more than 10 seconds. However, now what I've done is, after I click submit, my test has to wait 10 seconds every single time before it continues and validates the user table. While this is more of a dynamic wait, it's only going to wait up to the amount of time it needs to before continuing. So yeah, hard-coded waits, especially if you throw them really high numbers, they might solve your problems, but you're actually slowing down your tests unnecessarily when there are much better tricks to use. Another trick I could use instead is you can do kind of one-off timeout increases on specific commands. So I could come down here in the user table, and I can increase that default 4 seconds to something like 10 seconds. So because Cypress internally retries its commands, it's going to get my user table. It's going to look for my user, and if it's not there yet, it's going to keep doing that up to 10 seconds. So this is a cool little trick for maybe one-off timeout increases. You could, of course, globally increase all your timeouts, but I typically don't recommend doing that, because I think you can kind of bury real API issues in your application if you just wait like 45 seconds for everything. I don't think you're getting all of the story about how things are performing. I also like this method the best, because I think it provides a little bit more context into what's actually happening in your application, right? If I got rid of this, this would actually probably solve my issue. But when I look maybe a month from now, I might ask myself, well, why did I have to wait 10 seconds? You know, what's the story there? Versus something like this, I'm like, oh, okay, we're making a post call, I can have one forget. You need a little bit more context into what your application is actually doing. And you eliminate all the race conditions. So those are kind of some common ways to resolve and common problems I found throughout my experience and things that I've done myself. So let's go back to the presentation. Let me switch back over there. All right, so now we've kind of talked about how you handle what flake is, how you identify it, how you can resolve common types of flake. So let's talk about this concept of no more flake long term. The hard truth of it is that flake is going to exist regardless of your tool that you use. It's not Cypress specific. It's not Playwright, Selenium, whatever the next tool is. It's also not app specific if you build with React or Angular. And it's also not the way you build your tests. You can have flake with page object model if you use Cucumber. Flake happens because of all of those variables, right? There are so many variables that can impact how your test runs. And ultimately, the way to get into a state of having no flake starts with culture and the way you think about flake. And you take it seriously. It starts with that culture of accountability. So as soon as you identify flake, you try to remediate it quickly as possible. You get into that state of, okay, how do I break this down? And then how do I solve it fast? One way you can do this is by shifting left, getting your tests and your test results as quick to any change that happens as possible. So if a developer pushes up a new feature, am I going to run tests before that code makes it into our main branch or something? Or am I only running my tests once a day? If I'm running my tests once a day and I have 100 tests and the devs pushing 50 changes, and I wake up the next day and now I have 20 flaky tests. How am I going to know what caused that flake? Was it my test? Did they do stuff to the environment? How would I know? You spend a lot more time debugging when your tests are separated from changes that occur. So if you shift your tests closer to actual changes, anytime an environment change happens, anytime test change happens, if you're modifying the test framework or upgrading Cypress, are you running tests to make sure they're not flaky? So any of those variables as they change, are you getting that feedback fast? One other kind of common approach is test-driven development. So, writing tests before maybe the development happens. Not saying you need to do this to resolve flakiness. It's just a strategy and another way of thinking about how you get that feedback as close to changes that happen as possible. And then, of course, you want to fail fast, right? It's this concept of catching things quickly and ultimately getting into a state where you're not building up this backlog of flake, where you don't look at that analytics page and say, oh, shoot, we have 22% test flake. And instead, you're catching things as soon as they happen. But then you also have to have the hard conversations about considering your test value. If you have a test that is flaky and you're spending days and days and days working on it, is it actually valuable? Do you need that test? Do you need help? Don't spin your tires in the mud, right? You don't want to ever get stuck, but you want to consider when is the right time to move on? What is my time worth spent on? And what is the overall value of, we all want everything to be perfect all the time, but sometimes you have to have that hard conversation and bring in other resources. And then, of course, just, as soon as you identify it, try to troubleshoot, quarantine it, use those if-that-only tricks, use test replay, which I wish I could have shown in the pipeline, an amazing, cool new tool, fantastic for debugging, gives you the whole story of what's going on, helps you understand those variables. And then also maybe start documenting the failures. It's kind of a silly one, but one thing I've realized as I've kind of wrote more automation tests is the difference between maybe junior engineers and senior engineers is not maybe how smart they are, but how quickly they can identify common failures and just understanding patterns and just this way of thinking about, oh, I've seen that wait failure before in my example that I showed earlier. So in my mind, I know that wait failure is either associated to me using the command wrong or a certain race condition, right? So I already know specifically in my mind where to address that issue. And so just documenting might help you kind of gather patterns over time. And then, of course, all these things can be used with Cypress Cloud, all those flake features. But you also have spec prioritization, which is a kind of a cool, neat feature that actually prioritizes any previous failed tests. So if I have a suite of 100 tests and 10 of them failed before, I can actually enable spec prioritization, and it's going to run those 10 failed tests first. And that in combination with run cancellation, which allows you to identify how many failures you want before it cancels the entire run. So if I say I want to get if 5 failures happen, cancel my pipeline, give me that feedback. So what happens is it runs those 10 tests first, and if still 5 of them are failing, I actually get that feedback right away. I don't have to wait for the other 90 tests to run for me to know I still have issues. So again, this concept of we're getting fast feedback, we're shifting left, and we're driving kind of that value as quick as possible. Okay, and of course, if that doesn't work, you can just trash your entire test suite because you won't have flaky tests if you don't write any tests, right? Just kidding, don't do this. But hopefully, some of those tips before helped. I hope you never have to get to this point though, where you have to resort to drastic measures. Whoops, let me go back. All right, so kind of as to recap, just a little bit, highlight everything we've talked about. Confidence is everything, right? That's why we do our jobs. We want our applications to be the best they can for our customers. We want to deliver the most value. And if you can't trust what you're doing, then why are we doing it, right? But at the same time, flake happens to all of us. So instead of kind of getting frustrated with it, if you start to look at it as kind of like a problem and break it down, we can start to see better results. And this thing that was once magic can be broken down into chunks that are actually much more digestible. So always ask yourself, is it flake? But that means, retry responsibly. So retries are a really cool and powerful tool that Cypress enables and allows us to identify flake, but don't use retries to hide flake, right? Just because you see flaky tests doesn't mean you should increase the retry limit just so they kind of disappear, behind the scenes. look, all of our tests are green, but behind the scenes, half of them are still flaky, right? That doesn't do anything but make us feel good. When in reality, can we even still trust, the overall quality of our application? Resolving tests. Ask yourself, what is the failure? Break it down. What is the actual failure in combination with what has changed? So if your tests are running close to any changes, code, test code, applications, you should have that concept combined with that failure and any other resources like test replay to really give you a story about what might have happened right away, and that we can address the problem pretty quick. But also, again, just utilize the community. Don't take it personally when I say that your problems probably aren't special, right? Like, we're all in this together. We all use Cypress. Chances are, if you've seen a failure and you're stuck on something, hundreds of us have seen it too. Utilize the Discord channel, Stack Overflow, lots of resources online, great blogs, sessions. There's all these tools where we're all trying to solve these problems together because it is a really hard problem to solve. And again, just that idea, culture of ownership. Ask yourself after solving Flake, what have I learned? So when you see that problem again, can you fix it faster? Or maybe now that you've learned something, you'll never see that problem again because you're constantly thinking of that variable. And then, of course, just practice makes perfect. I still write flaky tests. It just happens. There's too many variables to control, but all we can do is just understand the biggest impactors, what we can do to make our tests better over time. Then it's a slow it's slow progress, but the seeing your tests improve is a really rewarding feeling, and hopefully you get to that state as well. So awesome. So thank you so much. Let's go out there, automate all the things, and hopefully you learned a trick or two.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Before we get into the QA portion, if you don't mind going to the next slide, we do have a poll that we'd like to surface here for anyone who would like to speak to a Cypress expert after the insights and learnings from this presentation. So feel free to vote on that poll. And if you are interested, a Cypress expert will be in touch over the next few weeks. With that said, David, we have a lot of questions in the QA chat box. So I'd love to get some of those over to you, especially where I am seeing a little bit of overlap. So I think the first one that I really want to address actually is how are you able to isolate flaky tests using retries when you have before hooks with sci.session with test isolation enabled?
Okay, sorry, let me make sure I understand that question. So how are you able to isolate flaky tests when when you're sharing state in a before each hook?
Correct, exactly.
So I would just kind of treat it the same way you would any other test, right? You just single it out, only it. Just because you're sharing the same setup with other tests, maybe that's actually a good indicator on its own, right? Is if you have 5 tests that are sharing it before each hook, but maybe only one of them is flaky, that might tell you right away, maybe your before each isn't the thing that's flaky, or it might be impacting 5 of those tests. So that actually might give you more of the story that maybe the flake is in the actual test itself. Now, on the flip side, if all 5 of those tests are flaky, that tells you maybe there's something going on with your before each hook. Again, what I would do is I would just single it out, run it over and over again. And it just comes down to understanding what the problem is, what this particular flake is, what the error, tracking that back to the particular area of code, and then just kind of working backwards from there. So I actually think if you only have one test that's flaky and it's sharing setup, that's probably a good thing, right? Because that's telling you maybe where the test flake isn't.
Yeah. Cool. I really appreciate that. I think that was super insightful. Another question that came in that I think probably, I would be really interested in kind of hearing your thought process. I know some organizations have a very, very high threshold when it comes to flake, and that they won't deploy anything until everything is flake free and the entire test suite is flake free. Others have different notions or strategies behind that. But another question that came in was, actually, that is not the one I wanted to share. It was actually this one. Can you remove flakiness 100% of the time?
I want to come and tell you, I want to confidently say, yes, you can. But in reality, there's just so much randomness, right? that I would be lying if I said you could get to zero flakiness. I think that's what we all want to drive to. I think if you have a comfortable threshold, for me, 3% and lower is really, really good, although I always push for lower than that. And again, it just also depends on how big your test suite is. Is that 3% of 100 tests? Is that 3% of 1,000 tests? So that's kind of my benchmark. Those are kind of some things I've like a threshold I've kind of seen throughout the community. But you make your own threshold, right? Ultimately, you're in charge of your test suite and what your comfort is, and if you're comfortable with a 10% threshold, that's entirely up to you, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's your level of confidence and the value that you're delivering. I can always encourage us to lower that.
Love that. That's great. And a lot more questions coming through. Another one that we'd like to get some insight from. My tests pass just fine locally, but when I run them in Cypress Cloud, they fail more often. How can I practice running them in a headless environment so that it doesn't cost me the runs in the cloud?
Yep. So you can always utilize Cypress Run command headless locally. So you don't need the test runner locally. You can always simulate it faster. If we want, I can even, instead of, I have my Cypress script here, but I could also just CY run, right? You can just run headless, which of course is going to run a little bit quicker than it would with the test runner. I think I'm running all my tests actually, so that's going to run a little bit slower. But I would utilize the command line, right? I can specify what specs I want to. If I only want to run one spec, then you can kind of do it that way. So yeah, that is how I would practice. You don't always have to use the test runner locally. You can cut out the browser entirely and run things headless, and specifically pass in which specs you want to run. So. And then that in combination with it.only and describe.only, you can run one test, many tests, or the whole thing and kind of see what you get.
Great. Awesome. Fantastic. I'll keep running through this list here. Let's see. How do I run a single failed test from the emulator instead of running the entire file?
How do you run a single test from the are you talking about so you would just do the it.only here. So it.only means I'm going to run just this one test. If I want to run a group of tests, I can .only that. So yeah, it.only, unless I misunderstood that question. But it.only is your friend and what we were showing in those examples.
Yep, that makes sense to me. And Raghav, if that's unclear, I don't know if you're still on this webinar, but if it's not, feel free to ask a more clarifying question in the QA chat box, and we'll try to address it. Another question that I think could be a good one to bring out here. Let's see. Let me keep going through this list. All right. So if and I feel like you addressed this already, but I do think it's a good thing to maybe, I don't know, readdress, because this question seems to have come up a few times. If flake happens in cloud and not locally, what are your tips for isolating the issue fastest? So spec prioritization and run cancellation help, but still requires commit, push, trigger pipeline, spin up server, etc. And it's time expensive for experiments to isolate the root problem.
Yep. So if you're, so in cloud, what do you want to isolate so spec isolation and run cancellation. Yeah, that's just how do you get feedback faster, right? Which is useful in its own right, but it doesn't tell us, how do we move forward from there. So what I would do after that is I would just utilize cloud and test replay. Honestly, like that is kind of the biggest tool, especially with pipeline failures. Is test replay is so incredibly useful, and I wish I actually had a real application to walk through that. That's a whole topic on its own. But utilize those recordings that are uploaded into Cypress Cloud, right? Utilize test replay, so you can actually walk through what happened in your pipeline and isolate that issue. And then once you've kind of understood the failure and seen what is actually going on in the pipeline, then you can try to start reproing it locally, either with the test runner or running that same test headless as well, especially if it's a race condition thing. I will say if you have Flake in cloud and not locally, chances are it's a race condition thing or an environmental thing, right? Like pipelines are usually a lot faster than running locally. So that should give you one variable right there, what might be flaky. And then in particular, are you running against a different environment in the cloud versus locally? So those two variables, I would really, really start thinking about. That's the most common failure I see especially when run in cloud versus local.
Great. That's fantastic. And then another question that came in, what if there were subsequent for requests to the same endpoint? Will the side.wait stop after intercepting the first one? How do how do you make it so that it waits until the fourth one?
I believe what you do, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe somebody might know this. So you can, I believe Cypress has like a times. I think there's like a times. You can tell it to wait, up to 5 times. If I remember, maybe somebody, if I can't remember the syntax. Or what you can do is you can actually just tell it to wait 4 times here, and it's going to wait 4 times for that request to be matched. But I thought there was a times payload option or like option. So correct me if I'm wrong on that. It's been a minute. Someone might have that information.
Cool. Yeah, I guess if anybody in the group has more clarity on that question, feel free to pop into the chat. Obviously, this is a community-driven webinar, so any insight that anyone has would be super, super appreciated. And then, David, I think we have time for one more question. I really liked this one, so I'm going to bring it in.
Yeah, it is times.
Oh, wait, hold on.
Sorry. Thank you for confirming it's times. Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. What are your thoughts on governance for test flakiness? So keeping confidence in tests while also keeping folks accountable to fix their flaky tests.
Keeping confidence. Yeah. So this is, I mean, that's the hard one, right? Like we're talking about how hard code is and how hard keeping all of these technical things in sync are. But, the biggest challenges are ultimately just culture and actually doing it and keeping ourselves accountable. And I wish I had a good answer for you other than it just starts with you do it and you hold people accountable, and you need to get the right people in your organizations to back you up. If you live on an island and maybe you're testing at like in a waterfall approach and you get all these changes and you're testing at the very end of it and you're screaming about flaky tests, but nobody's listening, you're not going to see a lot of progress there. You need to start getting champions in other parts of your organizations, whether that's product or other developers bought in as well. Bring everybody together, because ultimately it's not a he versus me thing. It's not a title thing. It's we want to deliver the best quality, right? Quality is everybody. We should all be invested in our organizations to deliver best quality. And that's the message that needs to start from the top down. So if you're facing just overall culture problems, start with your management, start with your leaders, talk to them about the problems, and start to try to drive influence if you're not able to in other parts of the organization. And then you can start moving towards that idea of shifting left, getting feedback faster, so everybody's kind of aware of these battles you're facing. So it's a really hard thing to do in practice. I'll be honest, it might take months or even a year to kind of get that point. But you can kind of see the benefits once you start doing that and really save yourself time and ultimately get to a place where you're chugging along and you're really confident with what you've done.
Great. Love that. Love that insight. I think that puts us at time.